Excellent. Welcome back. I'm really excited. This is like 5 years in the making. I
It
met
is.
this guest more than 5 years ago, and both she and I have grown a lot. So let me, without any further delay, share her official introduction. In a world filled with unexpected challenges, today's guest has transformed her life's journey into a beacon of support and guidance for widowed parents. For 2 decades, she led transformation projects for IBM across 5 continents, mastering the art of managing cross functional teams and implementing innovative business solutions. However, at 43 years old, her life took an unforeseen twist when she became a widowed parent to 2 young children. She discovered that resources for widowed parents were scarce, so she decided to fill the gap. She created the Widowed Parent Podcast, an insightful show that explores the real life stories of widowed families, providing a platform to share their perspectives, reflections, and invaluable advice. She's the author of 2 books: Future Widow, Losing My Husband, Saving My Family, and Finding My Voice, and Widowed Parents Unite: 52 Tips to Get Through the First Year from One Widowed Parent to Another. She founded the Widowed Parent Institute, further solidifying her commitment to helping others navigate the challenges of solo parenting after loss. Her work has been described as real and relevant, intermixed with a sense of hope for the future. Please join me in welcoming Jenny Lisk. Welcome, Jenny.
Thank you so much, Robbie. It is exciting to be here with you, and especially the day after my second book was published. This is kind of all part of the celebration of that. So I'm thrilled to be here with you. Thank you.
It's really awesome. And I really did know you when, but now we're going to go into the Wayback Machine. To kick things off, this is a show about building strong networks, and the context is leadership. So tell me, how do you define leadership, and when did you realize you had the skills to lead?
This is such a hard question. I don't know if everybody has trouble with this question, but I thought you might ask me because I've listened to your shows and I know that a lot of people have had some interesting answers on this. I think I'm going to answer it in sort of the negative case. Like it was a time that I stepped back when I actually realized that I tended to step in and lead. And it was it was so strange because I think that, when you do something naturally, you don't even realize you're doing it. And I think about it as an analogy, like my daughter, she's in high school, she's an artist. And if you were talking to her and you said, "When did you realize you had artistic talent?" I think she'd probably say, "Huh? I don't know. I've been drawing my whole life. Like, isn't that normal?" Right? And I think it's the same thing. So this was a case when I was in college. And so this is not some lofty like example. Uh and it was like a weekend and there was a party on campus, big party. And for some reason, like all the people in this sorority wanted to go to this party off campus and then come back and go to the party on campus. Right. So it was a task. How do we get 20 or 30 girls? Right. And who has cars and who wants to be a designated driver and all these things. Right. So this friend and I stepped in and we're like, trying to sort all this out. And then my friend looked at me and she said, "You know what? We don't have to do this. Like, we are always doing this. Let's let somebody else figure this one out." And I was like, "Huh, really?" And then, she's right, like, and I had just like stepped in and started figuring out we should do this and let's ask this person and whatever, right? Without even realizing that that was just stepping into the gap to solve this particular problem, which again is a silly, like, let's get 20 or 30 girls from one party to another, right? And I think about that sometimes as you know, it's not significant career wise, but I think it's significant for introspection,
Mhm.
right? To be that first realizing, like, wait, is this what I naturally do? I never noticed that. I never noticed that I was an artist. Not me, boy, my daughter, right? I never noticed that I tended to try to solve problems. And which leads me, I think, to the other part of your question: how do I define leadership? And that's a hard one because to come up with something that is broad enough to be generally applicable and yet specific enough to be meaningful, not just platitudes or something, right, is a tricky one. And I was really thinking about this, and I thought, I think that it is the ability or tendency to see a gap between how the world, now I'm going to put the world in air quotes here because I'll come back to this, but how the world is, a gap between that and how it could be or should be. And so I think that could be, okay, so what's the world in this case? Well, it could be a big thing. Like, I don't know, pick one of the many problems we have in society right now and, trying to see a gap between how things are presently and how they could be or should be and articulating the vision for where we could be and then marshaling the people, the resources, the discourse, the whatever it is to start moving us towards closing that gap, right? It could be something as big as solving a big societal problem. It could be something as small as, how are we going to get 20 or 30 girls to a party, right?
Great callback.
And it could be something in between, which, I think we'll get into here. But in my case, seeing this gap that I became a widowed parent and I was like, where, like, right now I'm tongue tied. I was tongue tied then. Where is the information? Where's the resources? Where's the support? How, we have a gap here.
Hmm.
And then deciding that I should like appoint myself to try to fill that gap.
In a lot of ways, you've always been who you are, and
Mm,
the circumstances of your life changed over time. But your instincts were
mm,
to recognize the problem, see the possibility, marshal the resources, the people, the discourse,
mm.
measure the result,
Yeah,
do it
and
all over again.
articulating the vision and adjusting as you learn
Hmm.
more or as things change or whatever, right? There's a whole
Yeah.
complex, but I think that could be applied across all sorts of scenarios. Um, and like I said, whether it's the tendency or the ability or something to put yourself in that position of like, I'm going to close this gap, whatever this gap is that's important to you in your world and your life, based on where you find yourself.
I want to test this hypothesis that you are who you've always been.
Okay.
Take me back a little bit. Always curious what my guests were like when they were kids, like on the playground, or did they run for student body office or get involved with after school clubs, or did teachers see potential in them? Did they see potential in themselves? Like, what kind of kid were you? Were you the one organizing your friends in the playground to make sure there was enough people on each team? Like, were you sitting back reading a book? Like, how'd you show up?
Okay, so what kind of kid was I? I was probably quiet. I played sports every season. I think that some of my leadership came out and like I was the captain of the varsity basketball team, like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I don't, no coach never told me why I was the captain. I don't know. He just made me the captain. Like, um, I was, quote unquote good student type of person, right? You're asking about teachers. Actually, it's funny. I remember my favorite high school social studies teacher who I had for multiple classes. So I had a chance to get to know him over the years. Um, because I didn't raise my hand in class a lot back then. And it wasn't until we had an assignment where I had to write a paper. And this is sort of a backhanded compliment. He gave me like an A or an A plus, I don't know, something on the paper with like some great comments. And he said something like, you know, you haven't really said anything in class. I didn't even realize that you like had anything to offer here, basically. Like until you read this paper, he was like, wow, where'd this come from? So that was an interesting I think that I think I've always had the tendency, but maybe the confidence or ability to act on it
Hmm.
was longer in coming.
It is interesting that for sports teams, you were being picked as a
Mhm,
leader because you
mhm,
must have been good with your peers
mhm,
and probably felt more comfortable kind of in that space than maybe like raising your hand in class, which is
mm.
it's a different, I don't know, it's like a different skill set.
Yeah, mhm,
And the confidence needs to come from someone like a different maybe experience of it being, like trying it.
right.
Did you have a sense at 12 or so years old of what you were going to be when you
Oh,
grew up?
yeah, I was gonna be Perry Mason.
You're going to be Perry Mason.
Yeah, totally, and so for people who maybe aren't familiar, Perry
Yeah.
Mason was a lawyer, and originally it was a bunch of books that came out, I don't know, probably in the 1950s or something.
Mhm.
My parents had some of the original paperbacks. In fact, I think I've still got them somewhere, and they're like these old 1950s paperbacks with, like, the paper all, yellowed and stuff, and, but Perry Mason was a lawyer, and he was a criminal defense lawyer, and he solved every case with all these, courtroom he had very he was smart and he got the guys to admit guilt on the stand and it was very exciting and I think it was this the sense of I don't know, justice or something in the sense of I don't know what I loved about it, but I was gonna be Perry Mason.
Wow. And did you know, besides this fictional character, was there anyone in your life who, like,
Who
had
was
that
a
kind of
lawyer or
spirit
something?
or, like, fought for justice or
No, I didn't nobody really close to me and family or anybody was a lawyer of any sort, much less a, defense
yeah.
lawyer or a criminal lawyer or something like that, or a trial lawyer.
How long did
My
this dream last? Did it last until you actually got to college?
I was gonna go to law school. Um, I was intending to. I was poli-sci and econ major, and I took constitutional law, like an undergrad constitutional law class my sophomore year, and it was a class that normally seniors and sometimes juniors took. And the person who taught it, the professor, was a brilliant lawyer and known for being very tough. Like she taught the class as if it was a law school class, like writing case briefs and calling on people. And she ended up becoming I think on the Oregon Supreme Court, a justice. Um, so yeah, I haven't talked to her in forever, but yeah, I thought I was gonna do that and I never did. But I was gonna say you were asking about people in my life. My mother was on the city council in the town that I grew up in, actually the town that I live in now, for 2 terms when I was a kid, and so when I was probably 8 or 10, maybe, she ran for city council the first time, and I remember, holding up signs on election day and folding the brochures and, all the things, going around knocking on doors and, "My mom's running for city council, can I give you a brochure?" That kind of thing. So, yeah, that was definitely a powerful example there.
Yeah, seeing that up front and being a part of that experience and seeing
Mm.
her put forward and, like, fear of rejection, but yet she's gonna do it because she believes in what she can bring as a leader.
And she ended up being the council president, I think, in her 2nd term, which is a position picked by the 7 council members pick one of themselves to be the council president.
Yeah, yeah. That's a really cool example to see that up front, and,
Mm,
so it's interesting because I was a poli-sci major.
hmm.
In my 3rd year of undergrad, I discovered sociology, and I
Ah.
finished sociology as a 2nd major in, like, 3 semesters. Like,
Wow.
I just was like, "Oh my gosh," and, like, just
Yeah,
did it all.
yeah.
Fortunately, I was pretty far ahead with the poli-sci, so I ended up finishing with both
Mm.
and some minors in there. But I took constitutional law, and
Ah.
that and, like, some session I went to about, like, should you go to law school, convinced me not to.
I don't know, sometimes I still think about it, right? Like,
Yeah.
wouldn't how fun would that be to go to law school? Now, I'm 51, so by the time I could actually do it, it'd be a couple more years probably, and then by the time I'd finish, I'd be in my mid-50s at least. But,
I've heard of stories that would make that not that extreme.
yeah, I think, and to be a student now too, like, when you're a student, when you're younger, you're like, "I gotta get through this, I gotta get my degree, I gotta whatever." And now I'd be like, "Wow, what?" Tell me more, like, wanna learn everything.
I took some evening classes as an undergrad, and the worst bell curve ever. All these adult returning students, like, like, paying their own way through
Yeah, who are
9
super
at night.
motivated. Right.
Yeah, they're super motivated, and I just didn't like waking up early. Hey, when you left college with this poli-sci econ degree, what was the plan? Where did you go next with that degree?
Well, I came back to Seattle and I started a job at the Chamber of Commerce doing like just education policy stuff. I didn't stay there very long. I decided that speaking of entrepreneurship, I was going to, well, first I think I was going to write a book, a sort of a book about being an intern at Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. Because I had done some internships there and part of my college was there. And, but this was pre-internet, this was a long time ago, so talk about, like, a networking challenge, right? How do you find enough people to interview or write pieces for, collect resources? There was no internet to Google and find stuff, and there was no Facebook groups to tap into to find people, none of that stuff, and, it kind of fizzled out, but I ended up deciding that I ended up getting more interested in business school, and I applied to the University of Washington for the MBA program and ended up doing that. And I remember I wrote my application that I was going to in my senior thesis for economics, I had written about starting a like an airline ticket exchange, like to have dynamic market pricing for airline tickets because airline tickets are so crazy, right? Like it's completely irrational what some of the prices are and how they change and stuff. And I was like, oh, we can make this better. And so I wrote my application for the business school saying like, I want to come get an MBA so I can go and then start this thing. Of course, I didn't end up doing that at all, but uh, but anyway, they let me in. I guess it was a compelling.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me a little bit like Priceline and hotels.
Well, exactly. It is a little like that.
Yeah,
Like when Priceline popped up some years later, I was like, what is this? Is interesting. Like this sounds a little bit like what I was,
yeah,
talking about. But yeah, so that was, and then I ended up at IBM, and I was there for 20 years.
yeah, and that's, I mean, that's a big place to land. Like, how did
Mm.
you get your foot in the door?
Well, my sister was there. And so she's younger than me, but she had gone to school in New York State, and IBM was recruiting. She was a math major, so IBM was recruiting people, when she was graduating from college, and she landed there. And then after business school, I actually started working for this little company that made basketball courts out of recycled sneakers and tires, which is a whole weird. Anyway, after like I don't know, not very long, they couldn't pay me, and they started saying, how about if you take your, how about if you work for stock instead of for cash? And I was like, yeah, but stock doesn't pay my rent. So I started looking around, and my sister said, well, they're always looking for good people. Why don't I pass your resume around? And the next thing I knew, they flew me back there, and I had just been married like 6 months before that. And we were like, hey, this sounds like an adventure. Let's go to New York. And, um, started working there.
And if your life had just sort of stayed on course, we wouldn't be here talking,
That is true.
because you were there for 20 years, which means you're a lifer. You
Mm.
were not planning to leave. You weren't going to jump into entrepreneurship. I mean, you just had a plan. And when did your plan start to
Yeah.
veer?
Well, the interesting thing is I would have liked to have left at lots of points, but I couldn't see a way to leave.
Hmm.
Like, when you have a job with a salary and benefits and a mortgage and all these things, right? It's not so easy necessarily to leave. And when we were there, actually, so my husband went to NYU for grad school while we were there and got a master's in urban planning. And so when we moved back out here, uh, I think your question was, how did my life change to the case where we're talking now? He ended up getting brain cancer, and it was 2015. So that's like 8+ years ago. And it was the strangest thing. He was totally fine. And then one day he started feeling a little bit dizzy and started saying some things that didn't quite make sense, but it also wasn't, he was mostly normal. Right? So then I was second guessing myself. Like, did he just like that thing he just said that sounded weird? Am I overreading the situation here? Like, what's the deal? Anyway, he got more and more confused over a week or so. And I ended up, we took him into primary care thinking that he had just started this medicine for like, whatever random thing that was just a rare side effect was cognitive confusion. So I was convinced, well, he's got one of the rare side effects. We'll just go in and change the medicine. He'll be fine. And the doctor said, let's do an MRI of your brain while you're here. And then, normally they call you back in 48 hours and tell you, or they put it in my chart or something. But they actually, at the end of the MRI time, they said, go back upstairs. The doctor wants to see you.
Wow.
And this is primary care. So they didn't, usually deal with this kind of stuff. And he said, well, there's something really wrong with your brain, to my husband. I don't want to scare you, but it might be glioblastoma, which is a super aggressive brain cancer with a single-digit 5-year survival rate. You need to see the neurosurgeon tomorrow. And the neurosurgeon would go in and says, we're doing surgery the following day. So this is like, wait a minute, everything was perfectly normal, and now you're having brain surgery? Like they're cutting your head open? And that was like, that's how it all started. And then he had 8 months worth of complications and cerebral spinal fluid leaking out of his brain and cognitive issues and ultimately hospice. And then he died in January 2016. So we're coming up on 8 years of that. 8
Mm.
years ago right now, we were in the middle of all this.
With
As
2
a
kids.
caregiver. Yeah, they were 9 and 11.
Mhm.
I was his caregiver and trying to parent. And, fortunately, this is one good thing about large corporations. And my boss, who was very supportive, he just kind of said, take care of what you need to take care of, um, which I wouldn't have been able to, do any of this if they hadn't been supportive. So I'll always be grateful for that. And eventually I started working, kind of very part time. Um,
Yeah.
so, and then he died, and then I was like, well, now, I got 2 kids, and what am I supposed to do? Right? Because, and this is getting to some of the gaps, right? But at that point, I was a parent of 9 years and 11 years for these 2 kids. But I was, an expert, if you will, in like regular kid stuff. I don't know if I was even an expert, but I was competent enough, right, in regular kid stuff. But all this whole thing of like, okay, now you got grieving kids. Well, that's a whole different thing. And so I went to Amazon and I typed in like, where's the book that's going to tell me how to do this? Some people have said that it's some like, the book What to Expect When You're Expecting, and then What to Expect the First Year, and then all that. Like What to Expect When the Other Parent Dies is kind of the book I was looking for. And there wasn't a book. And must have been around this time. Well, I don't remember the sequence of somewhere in there. Well, I joined Dorie Clark's group, and through that I met you. Um, Somewhere in there I hit on the idea that I could start a podcast to try to tackle something in this space. And I was talking with my therapist for all this time, and which is interesting because what started out as being like my husband died and I'm an instrumental griever, which is a whole nother thing we could talk about if you want. But anyway, I'm having all these flashbacks and like I don't know how I'm supposed to get any work done. Can you help me? And she's like, well, I'd certainly like to try. Why don't you come in and we'll talk? So what started out as like a grief thing became like a life thing, right? Like there's so much more than just the specific loss or this. It's a greater context of like, well, okay, well, I didn't die. So, and I'm only at the time 43. So, now what?
Yeah.
Right? And that was coinciding with this gap of like this widowed parenting thing was the hard, like I could see that there were resources for widowed people, as in for me myself, right? Like with my grief. Like I had a therapist, like I said, like I found good books. There's a thing called Camp Widow, which is amazing. There's all kinds of things that I could see that I could find support and find a way forward for myself. Where I felt lost was like, how do I be a parent to grieving children? And so that's where I was finding this gap and saying, what can I do about this?
There's so much to unpack here, and I think you use the term instrumental. What was the phrase?
Instrumental griever, as
Interest.
opposed to an intuitive griever.
Yeah. I mean, I just around the time that I knew your story, someone I knew who was a dad in a like at home dad group that I was part of, he was gone within like a week.
Hmm.
Same disease.
Oh, wow.
It was sudden. It
Wow.
was like he was the at-home parent. He wasn't She came home and like things were kind of in the wrong place. The house was a mess. Like he was a very organized, like put together, fully committed parent
Mhm.
to 2 young children, under 5 at the time.
Mhm.
And suddenly, like just little things. He had a little bit of a headache and then it was gone. Like, so
Wow.
I don't know what's worse, the suddenness that I don't know, ever really got over, or the 8 months of sitting by someone's bedside. I don't Both sound horrible.
And
And
you know what? And I'm sorry, I'll interrupt you for 1 second.
yeah,
What I've concluded and try to encourage people is to say, like, we don't need to compete, right? For
yeah,
like, and everybody tends to think their own thing is worse. And the people who had the sudden losses wish they had more time to say goodbye. And the
right,
people
right.
who had the long time losses are like, yeah, but you didn't have to deal with diapers and you didn't have to deal with 5 emergency room visits in 1 week and right, like all the things. And so I think it's just, I mean, it's all terrible.
It's
And so
terrible.
it comes down to like which part is going to be harder.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just, seeing how you responded, seeing how she responded sort of gives me a little window into this. And I don't think any of us know until it happens, like, what it would be like. But to be a parent and, like, having to, like, be there for your kids, and sometimes you just don't have the space to grieve on a schedule that you want.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and for you to recognize this gap in the market, that there was resources for widows, but not widowed parents,
Mhm.
and to start recognizing that you couldn't possibly be the only person
Right.
facing this.
Yeah.
Um, and then deciding that you might want to put something forward. And we got to work together a little bit back then, I
Mhm.
guess
Back in
2018,
2018. Mhm.
when you came in and you were like, I want to do a podcast. And I'd had a podcast for a couple of years. So I had a
Right.
little group of people. There was one other person from that group, our friend Tammy Goodler Loeb, who also launched a podcast.
And
Um,
she and I started our podcast on the exact same day.
yeah,
We didn't even plan it that way, but we're
amazing.
podcast twins.
It was it was really important that you had this space to like put energy into this. But I remember one of your kind of gaps was your network. I remember how excited you were to figure out who you wanted to talk to. And then you're like, well, how am I to get them to talk to me?
Right.
Like all this work to find like the author or the speaker or the
Right.
resource.
Right.
And then, who are you? Like you didn't have all the
Mm.
accolades and credentials you have today.
Mm.
What was that like when you had such like energy to do something good, but didn't know exactly how you were gonna pull it all together?
Yeah. It's interesting because I was in tech before for so long, and whether it's my education or my experience, my colleagues, everything was 100% different from this. So I knew literally 0 people in the grief world, right? 0. Um, and actually, before we get to that part, there's something else I think that's important on this thing of, like, finding a gap and identifying or, raising your hand to decide you're gonna be the one to fill it. I knew I wanted to start a podcast, like you said, but I was kicking around like, "Why me?" Right? Like, "Why am I the one to start this podcast?" And so it's like that hesitancy and "Okay, I wanna jump in and fill this gap, but, oh" right? And that kind of back and forth, the tension, and I remember, like, you told me, like, well, because I'm like, "Why me?" Like, I'm not a therapist, I'm not a parent, whatever, certified parent something or other, like, why does anybody wanna listen to me on this? And you said, "Well, you have your story, and that's powerful." And I said, "I know, I get it, right? Yes, that's part of it, but it still feels like there's something." And it's probably just internal to me, right? But finally, I realized that I was kind of looking at it if I flipped the way I looked at it, I was looking at it like I'm trying to be an expert, and I'm not an expert, and people are gonna recognize that, and so why are they gonna wanna listen to me? And I realized if I flipped it and I said, "My power here is that I'm not" at that time, "not the expert, so I can stand in the place of my listeners in the conversation,
Yeah.
right? And I can interview the experts and the people sharing their stories and whatnot, and ask on behalf, like as someone who is one of them, have these discussions. And that's how I got my head around like, because it's one thing to say, oh, there's a gap, so let me fill it. But then there's like the actual, how do you like get yourself to actually feel okay about, or have the confidence or whatever it is to do that. And so then to your point about like networking, I remember I started a list way back then. I still have the spreadsheet of like all the people that I could possibly interview. And, some of them are, quote unquote bigger people, and some of them are, authors, and some of them are like, celebrities even. Every time I heard of somebody that was related to this space, and the space, by the way, so, widowed parents is one category. People who lost a parent when they were young and now they're adult is another category. And then experts of various sorts is the other category. So I put people on my list like Prince Harry, because he lost his mother, obviously, when he was young, and he has a powerful story to tell about how that played out over his lifetime being a grieving child, right? And so obviously I haven't gotten to him yet. Uh, but I put some other people like authors that I knew who written books in the space, um, people who had podcasts, people if even if I heard of somebody, like somebody said, "Oh, my friend's sister's cousin, their husband died and they have these kids and whatever." So then like write them down. Maybe I'll talk to them. Uh, One of the people that I put on the list in the celebrity category was Melissa D'Arabian from the Food Network. Her mother died by suicide when she was in college. When Melissa was in college, I think she was 19. And I remember watching when she won the Food Network Star Show like a bunch of years ago, and I remember watching it and being like, "Wow, that's so amazing!" Right? And so I put her on the list. Like, oh, well, guess what? I interviewed her a couple of years ago, and and actually recently she left to go to. I forgot that she was on my list, and I she left to go to a grad school program, and I've kind of gotten to know her, and we had this like little Zoom going away thing, and I said like, "Hey, I was just looking on my spreadsheet, and I put you on my list in 2018, and look at this now, 5 years later, like here we are, like you know, friends." And she was on my show. So it's a long game for sure, right? In terms of thinking about like how to approach this. Um, what was your original question?
Yeah, let me jump back in here because this is really good, and I mean, I just love hearing you, like where you were psychologically, like
Mm,
the voice inside your head, like what it was telling you, how you had to like rewrite that story
yeah.
so you could kind of the pep talk you needed, and that you had this sort of wish list of people that 5 years later you're building these relationships with. Because there
Hmm.
was two things that I think you had to really figure out, because you were a work a day job at a company person,
Mm,
and you also didn't have entrepreneurship as like a background, and so you're also at the same time you're trying to build out your like grief and widow network. You're also joining. So earlier you mentioned you joined Dorie Clark's recognized expert community, and
hmm.
Dorie Clark is a amazing speaker and author and business coach, and
Mm.
teaches business class. I mean, she's amazing, right?
She
Global
is.
global superstar, and she has this program about how to become a recognized expert, and has this amazing Facebook community, which is where you and I connected.
Hmm.
And to find her opens up a door, right?
Yeah.
How did you find Dorie? Like, how
Well,
does a person who works at IBM know that Dorie's there? Did she come speak one year? Because I've heard that story from a few people.
yeah, no. Okay, this is the funniest thing. I am a certified project manager, and through the what do you call it? The project management PMI, Project Management Institute.
Mhm,
And to keep your certification, you have to do a certain number of hours every 3 years of continuing ed kind of stuff.
mhm,
And I was desperate to finish my recertification. And one of the things you could do, you could go to classes, you could do all these things, but you could listen to project management podcasts. And so I was like, "Ooh, I can do that. I can put these project management podcasts on, and when I'm walking the dog and when I'm cooking dinner and when I'm driving and literally every single minute that I'm not doing something else, I'll listen to a project management podcast and clock my hours." And this was around the time Dorie was on her virtual book tour for Stand Out, her second book, I think. And she was hitting the podcast circuit hard. And she was on some project management podcast talking about Stand Out. And I was listening to this and I was like, whoa, who is this person? Like, this is amazing. I have to get this book. And I bought her, $15, $20 book. That was my entry point into her world. And like, I was like, I don't care about the project management hours on this. I'll clock my hour or whatever to listen. But I was like, this is like blowing my mind. And I bought the book and I never like take notes and stuff reading books, but I did write down all these notes of like, because Stand Out is all about like how to like define the areas where you could stand like I need to read it again, but like defining the areas where you could stand out. And it was blowing my mind of like all the things I could do in this widow parenting space, and just it was giving me all these ideas. And I have to say, in terms of like, I was kind of an odd duck in her community for a while because most people there are not in the grief space. And there's lots of tremendous, amazing people, and most of them are doing things entirely different from what I'm doing. But I learned a tremendous amount from watching all of them and getting to know some of them and just watching others that I could apply to, like, when you're like, well, how do you build a podcast? How do you build a website? And I don't mean like how do you make the buttons? I mean like what do you put, and how do you like, what should you be, how do you put yourself forward like in this way, right? Um, how are these people showing up in the world, and what kinds of things are they doing? And how can I apply that into the grief space? Because most people working in the grief space come out of other backgrounds, social work and therapy and other kinds of backgrounds that are not business usually. And most of the people in Dory's group are in various business pursuits. So it was tremendously beneficial to me to watch and learn what people were doing.
yeah, and to leverage it because by let's say, launching a podcast, you kind of jump the line in the world of the grief space and like became a platform to raise the visibility of other people. And that idea is very common, like the idea of a podcast and using a podcast to leverage a network and to meet people is
Mm.
more common in the world of entrepreneurship and thought leadership than it might be. Like, I mean, my background social work. I don't think if I had stayed in that space, I don't think I'd be thinking about a podcast.
Yeah.
So I
Well,
feel
I
it's
have
like,
to say there are some really good grief podcasts, though.
yeah, but it's just like cool that you start to get an idea of what these new models could be,
Yeah,
and
for sure.
it's not it's a space that's not overrun, unlike business podcasts. You know what I mean? Like, it's hard to differentiate yourself in the world of like a business podcast.
Sure, sure.
Whereas you came out and like you become really good at it. You're also incredibly diligent with the technology piece. You're comfortable with that. You figured it all out. You got
Yeah.
good at interviewing, like you went all in. I mean, I
Mm.
watched you build a whole home studio. I mean, you've just really developed a presence. So it comes across with a certain brand recognition
Mm,
and like
mm.
you're just becoming known. So
Thank you.
you put all these pieces together. You decide to write this first book. How
Mm.
soon into all this did you write the first book? The podcast came out in 2019.
Uh, well, you know what? Next month, and I know that because November is Children's Grief Awareness Month. So as your listeners listen, it might be slightly after, but 2018 November, so just about 5 years ago, I started
Amazing.
it.
So we were talking about you and Tammy Gululo. It was in early 2018, like the first and second quarter that we were talking about this idea you both had.
Right.
The fact that you both 6 months later, like had it
Mhm.
up and running on the same
Yeah.
day, no less. We'll put
Yeah.
a link to both your shows.
Yeah, and Tammy's show is terrific. She's had a lot of great guests on there.
Yeah. Working from the Inside Out is the title of it. So
Mm.
when did you decide to follow up with a book?
Well, I mentioned before that I had gone to Amazon to try to find the book that would tell me what to do, and I didn't
Mhm.
find it. And I'm like, okay, well, I have to write that book. Now I still haven't written that book. That's going to be the magnum opus, right? So that's probably a 2025 or 2026 book at this rate. And because what I realized is that I need so the podcast interviews are great for lots of things, and also they're great for the research for that book, right? So I'm interviewing the experts, I'm getting their stories, I'm building the relationships, I'm getting, I mean, I might end up using just some quotes from our interviews, and I may also end up going back to them and saying, "Can we go deeper on this or that?" Right? Um, but I realized that that book had to wait because that I mean, I'm not really joking about the magnum opus thing because this I really want to nail it with this book in terms of the content. And it's not so easy because it's not like you can say, "Oh, you're a widowed parent, do X, Y, and Z and your kids will be fine and you're all done." Right? There's more like all these, different things. So, I decided to start I decided I could start more easily with my story, with a memoir. And I also and by the way, this kind of dovetails, when Dennis was sick in 2015, I was keeping a Caring Bridge journal, and so for people who haven't heard of Caring Bridge, it's kind of like a free online blog that people use, usually in medical crisis kinda stuff, to keep their friends and their family updated what's going on. So I had 8 months worth of blog posts that started out kind of matter of fact, like, he had surgery and he's in recovery and whatever. Maybe he's coming home next week, that kinda thing. Eventually getting more and more reflective of, like, sharing what was going on and, like, using my time driving back and forth across the bridge to go to the hospital to think about, "What do I wanna share? Like, what's going on here that I can give people an insight and a window?" So by the time I was done with 8 months, I had 15,000 words documenting in real time this journey of a young family with terminal illness.
Mhm.
And people were telling me, "Oh, you should write a book," and "Oh, you can just publish your Cambridge journal." And I was like, "Okay, I know this 15,000 words is something." Like, it feels like the start of a book. It doesn't feel like a book yet. Because a book can't just be like, "This happened, this happened, this happened, the end." And that's kinda what, what we had. And so, it took me a while to think about, like, how does it become a book? Like, how and what makes a memoir compelling. And also I wanted to, like I said, I knew I wanted to write this nonfiction handbook, at some point, but I didn't want to wait till then to start bringing in some things that I had learned that could be helpful to people. And so I told the story as a memoir, but wove in some, like, I wish I had known this or that or done this or that, so that people could get some things out of it right away. Plus, the memoir aspect. So
Yeah.
it was published in January of 20. Wait, I got it. This pandemic has messed me up on timing here. January of 2021. Yes. And it was actually the summer of 2019. I was getting so frustrated. I was like, I got to start working on this. I got to, no, I'll just schedule some time and I'll schedule blocks. And I wasn't getting it done. And finally I was like, you know what? I'm going to clear my calendar for August of 2019 and I'm going to write 1,000 words a day. And at the end of the month, I'll be at 30,000 words. And I don't know if that's enough or not enough, plus the 15 I already had. But it felt like putting a stake in the ground, and at least I'll be close or something at the end of the month. And I did finish, that first draft by the end of the month. But then it was another year plus before it actually came out.
I mean, I remember reading it. It's really, really well written. It's a great story. It's, I think, a story that even if, you're not a grieving parent, it's one, and I think some of the content you've been sharing on social lately is also like, I can relate better to a grieving parent. Like, I feel like you're providing a resource to the rest of the community who wants to support people, and we, afraid of making a mistake, shy away. And so I feel like you're filling in gaps
Yeah.
that weren't named for me before. Go ahead.
So that was my secondary theme, if you
Yeah.
will, right? Like the primary theme, but this, and I call it grief allies, right? How do you be a good grief ally to your friend, your neighbor, your colleague who's grieving? And specifically in my case, who's a widowed parent, but it's broader than that. It could be anybody who's grieving a major loss.
Mhm.
And so because I had so many people in my life at the time Dennis was sick, for all that time, who modeled for me what it looks like to be a good grief ally without that word on it, no label, right?
Mhm.
But they were just so tremendous. And as I was writing the book, I was like, I need a layer to this book that shows people how they can do that for others.
So let's jump ahead to your second book,
Mhm.
because this time you followed actually a Dorie Clark model, which is go interview 50 some odd people that are awesome, get them involved, coordinate their stories. I mean, she has a massive network.
Mm.
You, when I first started talking to you about all this,
Mhm.
didn't.
Right.
Yet here you are with this book, an anthology, 52 stories. What a difference.
Yeah. Yeah.
So tell
Well,
us a little bit how it came to be.
and I literally started this. Now listeners can't see. I'm holding up a big old 0 here. 0 uh people that I knew in this space whatsoever. I talked about the spreadsheet that I started, right, with some ideas. But the podcast was really the starting point, because it turns out that when you have a podcast, you have a powerful, you invite people, and then time goes by, and then you start getting pitches, right? And especially when people have new books coming out, and or they have other things, they're a coach or they have something relevant, then they pitch you, and when somebody has a good pitch that makes sense for my listeners, I love having them on. I have to say I get a lot of lousy pitches that are like along the lines of like, I wrote a book, you should have me on, and I'm like, no. And uh or they're just not a good fit for the audience. So I started meeting a lot of people that way, and then I actually went to the National Alliance for Children's Grief annual symposium in 2019. um I've only been to it once because we've had COVID, and it was canceled one year, and then I've had various reasons I couldn't go. I am going next year for sure, because it's these are the people who work in the grief centers all across the country. And the grief centers, if you don't know about, many communities have grief programs. Like, I like to call them kids and family grief centers. They have programs for little kids and programs for teenagers and programs for parents. And it turns out, as I started, initially I felt like there's nothing, and what I realized is there's stuff, but it's disparate, right? Like, somebody needs to pull it together into, like, I could, through my podcast, I could pull together this resource, this idea, this author, this information, this story, right? And have a kind of a cohesive build out over time, a cohesive picture of what a widowed parent might do. And so anyway, through the podcast, I guess when I started thinking about this most recent book, Widowed Parents Unite, I knew I wanted to have a book that was more geared toward people in the first year of loss. Sometimes people ask me if my first book, my memoir, is, someone just died, is it appropriate for them? And I'm like, I don't know. It depends, right? A lot of people, if the person died last week and you send them a memoir, like it might not land right. It depends on the person. But I know I hear from a lot of people that they can't focus on reading a whole book. I'm like, but if we had something that was short pieces, you could sit down and read one or two and put it back down, and it's more suitable for the first year. So I said, all right, well, how am I going to get, it's 52 weeks, 52 tips to get through the first year as part of the subtitle. Ended up with 48 people. So a few of them had 2 tips that were so good. I was like, all right, I can't pick. You get 2 because I'm not going to, right? So the 48 people involved. I reached out through my email list and said, if you're a widowed parent, and I put together a form on my website, right? Like, this is what I'm working on. This is the kind of stories I'm looking for, the kind of topics. If you're interested, submit something. I also reached out directly to, by this time, because I had some of the people I interview on my show are widowed parents. And so I knew which ones the people I'd interviewed, had compelling stories that I wanted to just reach directly out to and invite them to participate. In other cases, for example, I really wanted to make this inclusive of dads, because there are way more resources on grief for women and for mothers. And I really wanted this to be for parents. And so I had some guys that, I had reached out to or had, come up, but I didn't have enough. And I knew it wasn't going to get 50-50 or anything like that, but I wanted to have more representation. And so I reached out to some colleagues in the grief space, and I was like, hey, do you know anybody that might be interested in doing this? And one person introduced me to a guy who runs the Widowers Support Network, which turns out is a whole Facebook group of widowed men. And some of them are older and have grown children, but a huge chunk of them are right squarely in my age range with children and teenagers. And so a bunch of them were interested, and I reached out, a couple other colleagues connected me with individuals. So it's that kind of thing that, 5 years ago, if I had said, oh, let me write a book and, have all these different people involved and start 5 years ago, I don't even know who I would have
I
asked.
mean, in some ways, you did start 5 years ago by building that network.
Yes. And by the way, and I don't know, before I met Dorie, that I would have done it this way. She's right, by the way, that you have to start building your network. She talks about networking, social proof, and content creation as kind of her 3 legs of the stool. For this book, I wanted to get endorsements, obviously, and I wanted to ask different people than had endorsed my first book. I had, I don't know, 10 or 12 people endorse my first book, and I wanted to ask a different 10 or 12 people. And I needed, because of a bunch of things, I needed them like fast. I needed them in like 2 weeks, which is kind of a, fortunately, this isn't a very long book, so it wasn't as I would not have asked them if it was like a 300-page book in 2 weeks turnaround. But because of building this network over 5 years, but that sounds wrong. What I really mean is building these relationships over 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
I was able to reach out to the right people, and they said yes, and they did it quickly, and they've been super supportive, and it's amazing. And I will, of course, help them and have helped them. But it's, if I was trying to do this 5 years ago, I would, and then somebody told me, oh, you need endorsements for your book, I would have said, well, who am I supposed to ask? Right.
Right. Just because you mentioned it, I have a resource to share with the listeners. Dorie Clark was on my show, I don't know, my first year, I think. back in 2016, early 2017. And she shared a resource that I love and I share all the time. And it's about what you just described, that three-legged
Mm,
stool. It's a little kind of assessment for becoming
mhm,
a recognized expert, and it helps
mhm,
you understand where you are
mhm.
around content, social proof, and network. And it's available at Dorie Clark, DorieClark.com/Robbie. And that's spelled Robbie. And we'll put a link in the show notes, and it'll get you that assessment, and you'll get on Dorie's list, which is not a bad thing to do because she's pretty awesome.
And let me just second that. I think that's a great resource. I've looked at it and filled it out as well. And I think her one of her points is you kind of you want to work all three. Like if you're way strong in one and weak in two, or strong in two and weak in one, that kind of pinpoints like, all right, you're doing great in networking. You got to work on content creation, or vice versa, like that kind of thing.
The thing I love about this resource, and I wish I had an assessment tool like it, is it's a snapshot of where you are and a roadmap for what you can do to
Mm,
improve in each of these three areas.
yeah,
So I have actually suggested to clients that they take it before they start working with me, and then take it every year.
yeah,
And just, or anytime they have a big shift in,
hmm,
like when I started shifting to Zoom, I waited like a year and then I did the assessment again to see
yeah.
kind of what I still needed to do to kind of shore up the three-legged stool. How wobbly is it? Um, we have to wind down. This, I feel like
No,
we could really chat for a lot
we could
longer.
keep talking about this all day long.
So as we get into our wrap-up question, I'm going to just give a quick pause to hear for a word from our sponsor. All right, my favorite wrap-up question is, we are staying in touch. We are always in touch. I've been watching you, even if we haven't interacted nonstop. I love seeing what you do. But let's say it's a year from now, and I or you remember that a year ago we've had this conversation during this important month, and I ask you, like, what are you celebrating? What are we toasting right now? In other words, what are you looking forward to the most in the year ahead?
Yes, well, oh my god, I could probably think of 15 things, and that would be too many, and I'd have to pull back and, like, not do all of them. But what I really my number one thing for this next year is to get these children's books into the world, and this is still in this ecosystem of widowed parents and grieving children. The idea being that, now I have a memoir, now I have a book with short form entries. The kids need support too. The kids of my listeners, the kids of my readers, the kids of the people in my world. And so I have this idea which, might sound a little crazy. It's 25 books. Uh children's book series, and the reason it's 25 books is that there are 24 character traits in positive psychology. And so there'll be one with each of those traits as part of the storyline. And then the first book though is going to be more of a introductory, introducing us to all the characters, and they're probably going to meet in a grief group or something. I haven't quite decided. My daughter, who's 16, is the illustrator, and she's already developed all 6 of our main characters. And in fact, I was talking to someone last night, and they said, "It sounds like your illustrator's outperforming you, the author, on these books." And I said, "Absolutely, she's outperforming me. Like she's done all she can do right now, develop the characters. I've got to give her storylines so that she can, uh, you know, turn the characters into stories." So I think we have NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month, in November here. And I'm going to sort of make it National Children's Book Writing NaNoWriMo for myself, and try to get a handle on the storylines and try to get those out into the world next year.
Wow. Amazing. Talk about a gap you see, a gap you step into. So
Mm,
it's like the kind of leadership that you really embody. I can't wait to celebrate that and support you and help you with all those launches and everything you've
thank you.
learned up until now to make that possible with your network.
Thank
How
you.
can people find you and follow your work?
Great question. If you go to widowedparentinstitute.com, that is my website where I have all my resources, my podcast, my books, um, social links, and all that. And actually, there is some information for grief allies on there. So if you're not a widowed parent, I have information for widowed parents too. But if you want to know how to support the friends and family, neighbors, colleagues, I have a really great email series with just like specific, like short tips coming out weekly. And I've got some stuff you can download on that. So widowedparentinstitute.com has all my stuff.
That's fantastic. We're gonna put that link in the show notes, and I also see I have a link to your YouTube, separately to your podcast, to Instagram, LinkedIn. You're in all the places. We'll make sure people can find you and connect with you. Please, if you do reach out to Jenny, let her know where you heard about her, so she can know that, and you guys can connect around this conversation. We'll put all the links in the show notes and on theschmooze.com. Jenny, I'm so excited that we had to have this conversation. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much, Robbie. This has been awesome.